Hello and welcome to Thwart the Account Takeover Menace. Join the API security conversation. Today's webinar is sponsored by F5 Networks and Google Cloud and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Keith Ward. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I am truly excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's content, we do have a few housekeeping items that'll help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel. I'll be asking the experts some of your top questions, so keep them coming throughout. Now, that Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is the first thing to do if you've got any problems. That'll fix most of your audio, video, and slide advancement issues. If that doesn't work, let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Next, check right next to the questions tab and you will see the handout section in your webinar control panel. You want to go there because you'll find that we are offering a bunch of outstanding resources, including a host of great links and downloads from F5 and Google Cloud, a bunch of stuff that you can get that you really need to be looking at. You'll also find links there to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's huge library of printed resources on technology topics. Also there, look for a link to the ATM Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events. I bet we've got some ones coming up really soon that you'll be extremely interested in. So look them over and sign up today if you see something that strikes your fancy. And next up, at the end of this event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Now, you do have to be in attendance during the entire event today to qualify for that prize. The official terms and conditions of the prize drawing can be found in the handout section if you want to read over what they are. Okay, next. One of the best benefits of this event and of all Actual Tech Media events is the opportunity to ask questions of our expert presenters. To help encourage those questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. After the event's over, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the best one, and we will contact that prize winner. All right, enough of the boring stuff. Let's get to the main event today. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our two experts, Angel Grant, Vice President of Security for F5, and Josh Hazlett, Strategic Technology Partner for Google Cloud. I am the non-expert in this little group, and I'm going to be helping to lead this discussion. They are here now with us. In just a moment, they're going to join me, and we're going to get started. Okay, Josh and Angel are with me here now, so we're going to dive right in. First question, and this is for you, Josh. Can you describe how automated bot attacks work? So questions like, how are they dynamic? What methods do they use to retool? And what role do APIs play in these scenarios? That's a lot of questions for you.
Well, thanks, Keith. Nothing like starting with an easy one. I think the first thing we probably should do is sort of address what automated, account takeovers are in the first place and how bots, come into play. So first thing is, automated bot attacks are a type of cyber attack that uses automated scripts or programs to attack a system or a network. And these can be used to steal data, implant or spread malware and disrupt operations for companies. And so you asked, how are they dynamic? Well, they can adapt to changes in the target system or the network. And this makes them difficult to defend against, especially if you're trying to do it from a manual perspective. And bot attacks use a variety of methods to retool, including, things like using different IP addresses so that they can appear as if they're coming from different locations, leveraging proxies or VPNs to try and, obscure their location. They can leverage different user agents to make it look like they're legitimate. These would be, strings of text that identify the type of device or browser that's being used. And then also using different attack vectors, exploiting vulnerabilities in software, or maybe even using social engineering techniques to trick users into clicking on malicious links.
Gotcha.
And Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to see if Angel had anything to add to that explanation.
Yeah, that was a great explanation, Josh. I think one thing to consider is the fact that bots can be very dynamic and they can quickly retool to avoid detection. And I'll give you a couple examples. So one example would be a bot being used to conduct credential stuffing. So that's basically where a stolen username password combo is being tested against multiple websites at the same time in an automated fashion using tools like Sentry MBA or Vertex to try to log in. They can easily retool based on the countermeasures that are put up to block the credential stuffing. You also see retooling against automation that's trying to manipulate business logic. So, for example, if you temporarily tuned your API authentication rules to freeze an account after 3 failed login attempts, they're just going to retool because they understand this business logic, and they're going to retool it so their bots will basically switch from one IP address to a different one after 2 failed attempts during that credential stuffing attack. Another common example of retooling is through client-side attacks, which basically is taking ownership of a legitimate website using tools like OpenBullet to conduct web scraping, or installing digital skimming tools like Mage Card attacks to automate the stealing of login credentials, payment cards, and different things like this. And that one has actually become such an issue that PCI has just issued new requirements in their DSS4 that was just published. And to answer the question around where APIs play in this automated bot attack world, it's important to remember that industries are looking for new and different ways to extend their services and be able to engage with applications and then engage in the third-party ecosystem in a faster way, in a more simpler way. So if you think about like a travel app, most travel apps don't just offer being able to book your airline reservations, but you can rent cars and get travel guides and check your weather and get real-time flight status update. Those are all API calls, and most of them are through various third parties. And again, they're being used for faster time to market. And this has caused this massive API sprawl, which has also created a scenario that is a much larger attack surface with more potential points of compromise. And this is making APIs a very attractive target for attacks, particularly around account takeover, because criminals know that most organizations lack visibility into what APIs exist, who's using them, what resources do they have access to, and what actual business logic those APIs expose. So we're seeing APIs being targeted by bots in a variety of different means, such as conducting reconnaissance. So they're going in and going through an automated process to map the organization's IT architecture and snoop around for that weak spot in the API by doing things like testing thresholds. For example, that 3 attempt business logic example I just gave. They're using the automation for attacks. So using bots to attack APIs and doing things like the credential stuffing example I use, DDoS, content scraping, injections, business logic abuse. And they're also using it for evasion techniques. They're using it to evade security defenses by creating distractions. And all of these things have really become very prevalent for threats around APIs. That OAuth just actually recently released their API security top 10 security list. So it's a very interesting topic that a lot of organizations really need to get their arms around now.
In a lot of ways, it's an API world, that we live in these days. So, follow up to that, Angel. For these attacks, what are the main goals or objectives of these bad actors using these attacks? What are they after, and what are they trying to get to? We know what ransomware does, for example. Is it similar? What types of accounts are at risk? Also, customers, employees, or others?
Yeah. So anytime I look at crime, I always remember that any type of crime starts with mom, not your mother, but means, opportunity, and motive. And criminals have easy access to all of those right now. So in this case here, the goal that they're trying to achieve really depends upon what their motive is. So the last M in the mom, ranging from financial crime by taking over accounts or impacting business operations, like a DDoS attack because they're upset with the company because they don't believe with their political or religious beliefs, or they may want to dox an organization by gaming business logic flaws with the intent to cause shame upon an individual at that organization or the organization as a whole. And basically anything any account that has a value associated to it should be considered a target. Anything ranging from personal information, healthcare, financial, gift cards, NFT, loyalty points, and even organizations' IP, and your entire ecosystem. Anyone who has access to any of that information should be considered a target.
Absolutely. Josh, what is your take on that? The main goals or objectives of these bad actors that are using the automated bot attacks?
Yeah, Angel, I really like that acronym. Sticking to the mom makes a lot of sense. The main goals or objectives of bad actors using automated bot attacks are typically to, as Angel mentioned, steal personal information, really to, do identity theft or, try and find other ways to leverage that information to gain financial benefit. Financial information, or intellectual property is also a good target. And, typically the bad actors are using things like malware to damage systems or to gain access to exfiltrate data. They're looking to disrupt operations. You mentioned ransomware, Keith, a moment ago there at the top of the question. By flooding a system with taking requests, or maybe even encrypting the data so that it can't be used by the company. And these are things that bad actors are trying to figure out. How do I, either commit fraud with the information or gain access to financial benefit. The also thing to keep aware of is that it's not just one target. The target-rich environment includes customer accounts, which could be used to make unauthorized purchases, employee accounts to steal data, gain access into the organization, typically done through social engineering, and administrative accounts, right, which have the highest level of privileges and are therefore the most valuable to attackers.
Absolutely. Okay, so Josh, let's look at this quickly from a CIO or C level perspective. I'm a C level executive for a company. How do I know if my organization is especially targeted, by these types of attacks? What makes some organizations juicier targets than others? And is it possible that my type of organization might actually be immune to these kinds of attacks?
Ah, good question, Keith. Unfortunately, I don't think any organization is immune to account takeover attacks. However, to your point, there are organizations that are more likely to be targeted than others. Organizations that would be considered to be high value targets, which could include, financial institutions, because of course they hold a lot of sensitive data where money resides, right? So think of things like credit card numbers, social security numbers. Those make them prime targets for account takeover. Retailers, which surprisingly have a ton of information for about us, not only our purchase history, from the things that we buy from them, but the shipping addresses, where we send those merchandise. Also, the data can be used to commit fraud or steal money, on that other person's behalf. Healthcare organizations, they have sensitive medical data. They have patient records, insurance information. Technology organizations, like Google, for instance, right? Like there are companies that house a tremendous amount of information on us as consumers and on businesses, that transact in those environments. And then, of course, government agencies, which have information like taxpayer information. And then, of course, if you're thinking about espionage, there are national security secrets that nation state actors would want access to.
So, Angel, since you're with F5, do you sense that there are some organizations that actually feel like they're not that, liable or to be attacked with an ATO type of attack? I mean, is there a comfort level that maybe they shouldn't have in your experience?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is a comfort level or a complacent level that I've been really surprised to see. I meet with a lot of customers and companies over the course of my career, and I'm in these meetings, and a lot of organizations saying, "Oh, we don't have an ATO problem, account takeover problem. That's just the banking industry." And so at that point is usually when we're like, okay, well, let us do an assessment. Let me show you what you're missing, and let us show you how much it's costing your organization. And a lot of times they're very surprised when we come back and show them what they're missing. And this is where it's an education and an awareness thing for a lot of industries that one is that, as we discussed before, all different users that engage within their environment, whether it's their employees, their customers, their partners, are targets because more than likely those guys are using the same username and password combo on their e-commerce site as they do on their banking site, on their airline site. So when one organization, the criminals will look for the least um, secure target to go after to get those and then test them against the more high value organizations. So there is a definite education that's still needed in the industry for the fact that everyone is a target. One of the things that I was looking at just recently, our F5 Labs team published a new report on unwanted web and mobile API automation that we observed at F5 over the first half of 2023. And this looks at 13 different industry verticals and the channels that were used to engage with those verticals and the organizations in them. And so, for example, when individuals were engaging with the mobile API channel, the industries that we saw had the most automation in that channel were telecom and entertainment. And when within the web channel, healthcare and telecom were also heavily targeted. And interestingly, we saw hospitality have a pretty large surge in automation in June as people were planning their summer vacations. And the factors that determine how much automation are typically targeting an industry range from the value, the security, risk, and deterrence of that industry. So just like what Josh was saying for values, like how much sensitive data an organization holds and what would be the payout of targeting them in using level of automation, like the gift cards and miles and points that Josh used as an example. They'll look at, for a given sector or industry, how well defended is it? How heavily regulated is it? You know, like banking is a good example. They typically have a larger budgets and teams focused on security. They look at risk. What's the probability of being caught? And what are the consequences if they were found? And they'll look for deterrence. What's the easiest way to attack one to get to another? So those are some of the things to think about when you're looking at your channel and ecosystem in the industries for account takeover.
For sure. So Josh, Angel was just talking about the consequences of these. So let's dive into that a little bit. What kind of consequences do these attacks have on user data? And especially from a regulatory compliance perspective, what impact is that going to have?
That's a great question, Keith. And I think to Angel's point, it seems like these days the most important and most valuable data becomes end user data, as far as how can that be used to either leverage the credit cards or social security numbers, passwords that they may have, credential stuffing, right? Was kind of the key thing there is, how can you get into higher value areas based upon password reuse? So they're really the other thing is attackers can also modify user data. So it's just changing account balances or shipping addresses, which can be used to commit fraud, and steal money. You've also got data destruction, where attackers can delete user data, such as account information or purchase history, which can make it difficult, to try and track the fraudulent activity. And then you've got data disruption, where attackers can, disrupt access to user data, such as taking a website offline or denying users access to their accounts. This, of course, not only is inconvenient for users, but then damages the organization's reputation and also increased costs on customer support, and then try to deal with things where customers have had breaches. So then, of course, we get into compliance issues, right? So these are all things that are really important when you're thinking about what is the impact to user data, and then how do you make sure that you're protecting against those type of breaches.
Angel?
Yeah, the regulators are on high alert right now on this given topic, because they've been warning for several years now that organizations have to have better data governance policies for all those reasons that Josh listed out. And they've tried a variety of different tactics to educate people on why it's important that they need to pay attention. For example, recently the GPA, or the Global Privacy Assembly, recently published guidelines on how to mitigate credential stuffing attacks. And that builds upon warnings that came from the New York State Office of the Attorney General, the SEC, the FBI, the list goes on. And now we're at the point where, from a regulatory compliance perspective, we're going to start see a lot more fines associated with organizations that don't have stronger data governance processes in place. There's impact that's going to impact them on how they're handling data breach notifications, not only notifying the regulators, but also the customers. Examples that is already needed is with GDPR in the EU, the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Protection Act, and then even the payment card industry, the PCI DSS standards have requirements around that. And right now, you're also seeing a lot of public organizations really trying to take a step back and figure out what they need to do to comply with the new SEC rules around disclosing key information regarding cyber risk. And I think that starts December 2023 that they really have to have that structured by. There's also financial penalties that will be implemented. I'll use GDPR as an example again. In the EU, they have fines up to, I think it's like 20 million or 4% of your annual revenue. There's legal liability for damages that are caused by account takeover. This can include things ranging from financial loss, emotional distress from a customer, for having to go through and reclaim their identity, and many other damages. And a lot of that results in lost customers and trust. And over time, their brand reputation will suffer.
So that actually leads exactly into my next question. So it seems to me, Angel, that there's several different types of harm that we're talking about here. There's direct bottom line harm, right? Loss of revenue.
Yeah.
There's also the reputational harm, which for a lot of companies can be just as or more damaging, than the financial losses. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think I need to make a T-shirt that says bot management means cost management. So maybe
I'll buy one.
My next part-time job. Yeah, so these types of attacks can negatively impact the bottom line in a number of different ways, both directly and indirectly, or quantitative and qualitatively. And it's important to remember this because many organizations, particularly right now, are trying to find ways to sustain both their economic and cyber resiliency with the current environment we're all living in. And organizations are starting to realize that these impacts are manipulating their bottom line. And we're actually seeing organizations starting to disclose language in their 10Ks to express to investors that there will be consequences if we sustain a cyber attack or other data privacy incident. We could suffer those loss of revenue, increased cost, exposure, significant liability. Like this is being disclosed in public companies' 10Ks right now. So examples of direct or quantitative impact. So if you think about an automated attack can impede your application performance. So your uptime could cause potential increase for infrastructure cost. So if you have like a bot scraping attack, the volume can compromise the app and platform performance time. And if you're not paying attention, you don't realize this is happening, you're going to actually think that's legitimate traffic, and you're going to overinvest in infrastructure capacity and potentially incur extra cloud usage charges too. Another example of an impact would be reducing app availability and business resiliency. So web apps that are overwhelmed with bot activity, like someone buying up all of Taylor Swift tickets, or a DDoS attack, which makes your site not available for real customers to engage, will cause loss of revenue, reputation damage, customer churn. You also have to think about your SLAs and contract terms with third-party ecosystems. So when your apps are overburdened with automation, it's going to impact your SLA. It's going to impact your performance, and sometimes that comes with fines to those third-party players. That also could skew your business decisions. So a lot of organizations look at their website statistics, the log data, the customer interacting metrics to guide business decisions on where to invest, or things to modify, like their pricing. It also manipulates their inventory. So if you have a bot that's purchasing up in bulk, it's going to lead to artificial scarcity and denial of inventory. And all of this too also leads to increased customer support costs. Automated bots can increase pressure on the customer support team trying to support all the incoming calls from customers saying, hey, I can't get into my account, or they're pissed off because their account was taken over. And when you're looking at those indirect or qualitative impacts, those are much more difficult to measure, but it doesn't mean they're any less important. So for example, the loss of customers you gave, or damage to brand reputation, you're seeing that on your Net Promoter Score, or even impacting employee experience. Right now, there's InfoSec staffing shortage, and a lot of them are overworked, exhausted, and feeling burnt out and overwhelmed. And when your automation's not put in check and in control, you can have higher churn and turnover with your employees.
Yeah. Yeah. Josh, Angel made it real when we're talking about Taylor Swift concert ticket availability. So, with that in mind, do you have any additional thoughts on this?
Well, I think I'm wearing the T-shirt. It's red underneath here, Angel. I'm with you. Bot management definitely means cost management, as far as I'm concerned. And
Yeah.
to your point, if it's done right, you can enhance your operational efficiency, right? You can reduce the business and financial risks, and control your IT spend, which frees up time for your security teams and fraud analysts. And then strategically manage, um, you know, as far as bots are concerned, right? Accurate detection and mitigation, and then provide an improved customer experience overall. So, as account takeover attacks are more common and they become more sophisticated, organizations need to be more vigilant when it comes to protecting themselves from these attacks. And of course, the cost is increasing due to the amount of data that's being stolen. Of course, the regulatory compliance that Angel was talking about, the fines that are increasing, and of course, SEC, recent ruling, where it's going to, be a shorter time for reporting. And then, of course, this also means that you've got to put things in your 10Ks as public companies, which then, leads to what is that long-term impact of these type of attacks. And it's tough to rebuild trust with customers and recover from those financial losses over the course of time.
If you can at all. I mean, and you can't always do that. So, so Josh, um, these ATO attacks, these account takeover attacks, are certainly a big part of security in the overall posture. They're certainly related, but they are not exactly the same as network application, or from these different perspectives, from network application API perspectives. How do you have to think about this differently from the ATO perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, right? So now we're kind of pivoting from what's the exposure, what's the risk, to how do we start thinking about defense? So yeah, there are different considerations, that you need to look at in each of those layers. But at the end of the day, you need to look holistically across the environment and each of the channels where the exposure exists. So from a network perspective, account takeover defense, really is about preventing attackers from gaining access to the network in the first place. And of course, that can be done by implementing, strong security measures, uh, proper firewall protection, intrusion detection systems, access control lists. You really need to make sure that you've got a good inventory of your network and your applications that are running in your environment. Make sure you've got telemetry and signals to detect anomalous behavior across that environment, that landscape. And the networking signals also, that would be relevant to bot protection, such as IP addresses, ASN, geography, looking at where these, queries coming from, where the APIs calls being originated from. And then, of course, TLS cryptography, suite implemented across that environment. So from an application perspective, account takeover defense really looks at protecting the application from being compromised once an attacker has gained access to the network. And this can be done by implementing security measures such as input validation, session management, data encryption. And this is key, from where do you collect the signals to distinguish bot from human type activity. And then also looking at any code that's running in the app on the client device that would be accessible to the attacker, and subject to reverse engineering and manipulation in that form. But you have to perform real-time access verification on protected resources and block requests that are using previously stolen credentials as well. So you kind of have to look at the full landscape. And
yeah, so that was the application perspective. Angel, what about the API perspective on that?
Yeah, on the API perspective, a lot of organizations are going with their comfort zone and what they know, and are doing things basically simply augmenting their existing WAF with API gateways to create, manage, publish their APIs while enforcing usage policies and controlling access. That's a good starting point, but I actually challenge organizations to think a little bit differently here, because what worked in the past and the way that you handle things in the past will not necessarily work in the future and be as resilient as you need it to be to to protect yourself against these attacks that we just talked about. That approach leaves a lot of gaps for the API security posture. And so this is where I challenge organizations to really start exploring more of that sophisticated web app and API solution that's fully integrated. And that would include things that like API auto discovery, schema enforcement, user and API anomaly detection. And by having more of that unified WAP or web app and API solution, you're actually going to get unified security across all your environments versus looking at things in silos. So having a sophisticated AI engine can actually help you identify credential stuffing, failed login attempts to discover API parameters, and then be able to quickly flag those attempts to your operations team to review. And this can be done by curating and analyzing network, device, environmental telemetry across all your data centers, clouds, architectures, so that you can quickly detect anomalous behavior and automated attacks that are going after your organization to conduct account takeover. So this is different than what you typically see with many API-only security point products, which typically rely on out-of-band analysis, whereas a WAP solution, it actually looks at things holistically and doing those things like I mentioned, traffic analysis, blocking of apps and API traffic, which happens within a single inline solution. So there's no need to go off and stream or mirror data to separate solutions, and then doing that can have negative consequences like delaying your analysis and detection and mitigations of the threats we're talking about.
Absolutely. And this is so important because it is very, very easy to launch these attacks these days, Angel, with all the scripts and tools that are available out there on the dark web. We used to call them script kiddies, right? A long time ago. Automated attacks that you don't have to be an expert anymore to do this. So how do these scripts and tools that anyone can get, with a credit card or a Bitcoin, it's made it easier than ever. And so how does this democratization of ATO attacks make things harder from the defender's point of view?
Yeah, you're spot on. Yeah, I've been in the cybersecurity space for a couple decades now, and it's very clear that cybercrime is actually more psychology and economics game than it is technology. But the dark web is loaded with tools to game both of those from a psychology and an economics perspective. So the tools that they can purchase are really a means to an end. And what we're seeing is the cybercrime ecosystem knows that many organizations are tackling their application development, their security, fraud prevention, all in separate silos and distinct silos within their organization, and not connecting it end to end. So we're seeing the modern cybercrime marketplace manipulating these gaps, and we're seeing criminals set up even more forums to help them orchestrate API-driven attacks well beyond, and like you said, well beyond the dark web. You can pretty much go to any social media platform. Like if you go in right now and type CVV dumps, you're probably going to see credit card information sold right there in pretty much any social media forum you're engaging with. But they can pretty much purchase anything to make the barrier to entry really low for even the least sophisticated criminal, like the script kiddie you just mentioned. But they have forums like the Genesis Marketplace that the FBI shut down. There's many other forums like that out there where they can buy login credentials, cookies, device TLS fingerprints, website vulnerabilities, and other sensitive data to overcome your security. So for example, they understand countermeasures you put up and can easily retool with leveraging tools like Selenium or Skilly to spoof legitimate users or look like a real device or a real browser or a real network. They can actually use these tools to make a bot look like they're human, to overcome things like behavioral metrics. So it will mimic a human's mouse behavior or the way that they're typing. And this is making it harder for defenders because the methods they use to retool will vary based upon the countermeasures they come across. So no matter the skill level of that criminal, they're going to start off with the cheapest and easiest thing they can find in that marketplace to maximize their return. And they will retool if the target that they're going after implements a countermeasures to deter what their original attack was going after. But they'll only retool if they feel that the reward still outweigh that increased cost to get that tool. And it's interesting, in these marketplaces, we're already seeing criminals discuss how to adapt their attacks and targets, manipulating Web3 applications by combining phishing and digital skimming to conduct things like crypto drainers and manipulate contract vulnerabilities. And we're actually already seeing AI used by criminals to further reduce the barriers of entries to accelerate these attacks. So, for example, we've seen AI be used to impersonate a support chatbot to harvest personal and financial information. We've seen AI be used to create sophisticated phishing attacks utilizing AI to impersonate individuals, both in the writing form when you see the email or in deep fake speech form when you have an automated call out. And then also, we're already seeing a lot of chatter in these forums and should anticipate AI to be heavily used by criminals to create polymorphic malware. Basically, what that is malware that can dynamically change its code to retool and so that it can sustain its functionality and avoid detection. And that will allow for exploiting vulnerabilities much faster because it can just morph as it's getting detected. And this is where, as we're looking at the situation we're in, this is where I strongly believe the cybersecurity industry must use AI to fight AI that's being used against us. So yeah, it's really interesting dynamic to see what's going on and how easy it is for criminals right now.
Absolutely, have to fight fire with fire, right?
Yeah.
AI with AI. So, Angel, can you describe the account takeover value chain and where automated and manual protections fit into the flow to thwart attacks, and how and where does API security fit in?
Yeah. So if you think through the typical account takeover value chain, it kind of flows like this. So a user's credentials compromised, a criminal buys it in one of the forums that I mentioned before. They target a site, or it could be many sites if they're using a credential stuffing tool, like we talked about before. They'll conduct reconnaissance on that site to identify that potential point of vulnerability. Then they're going to test the credentials. So they're either going to use them for their own financial gain. So if they test that username password combo, they can get in, they might use it, or if they know it's a legit one, they might package it up and sell it and resell it in the underground forums. But if they decide to use it, they're going to typically run an automated script to bypass the security controls that you have in place, which lead to account takeover. And once they get through that login, that's where the fraud actually occurs. That's a financial pain occurs to an organization where they cash out and steal stuff. So as you're looking at the account takeover value chain, I always try to remind people that bots are like the prelude to the kiss, and the kiss is what often results in fraud. So once an account is compromised by a bot, so a bot is a means to an end, so the bot compromises account, they could drain that bank account, purchase goods, service, and many other things. So that's the kiss, that's the pain, that's a financial loss an organization will have. So this is why your strategy actually should start with focusing on stopping attacks that start with bots and evolve into fraud. So you really need to guard your application's front door. So the moment the user enters your app, you need to be able to continuously monitor customer activity through that entire app journey to detect that abnormal patterns. And then you need to be able to decide, is this good or bad in real time by understanding the intent at each stage that user navigating through the journey, and then continuously validate who they say they are. But do this behind the scenes. You shouldn't have to introduce friction into that experience. You can do that silent verification behind the scenes by understanding their intent. And API fits into this because the way that criminals can now inject into the account takeover value chain is by targeting API flows, which basically is an API function like login, sign up, search, shop. And each one of those flows attracts different types of attackers. So for example, a login flow for an API attracts the credential stuffers or to conduct account takeover. A product search flow will attack scraping bots. A shopping flow, which would have things like add to cart, checkout, shipping, those will attract the likes of the sneaker bots and other reseller bots that you see out there.
Gotcha. Now, the image prelude to a kiss. All I could think of was the Dementor's kiss from Harry Potter, right? So sucking your life out. That's the kind of kiss I'm
Yeah.
thinking about, right in that situation. Okay, so enough of that. So anyway, just as in defense, where humans need to interact with technology, right? We use the tech to help us protect ourselves. We've been talking about that. The same is true for attackers, isn't it? So, can you talk about situations where, for instance, malicious bot automation and bad human actors work together in the same way to feed off of each other to avoid detection and increase the chances for a successful attack?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you two examples here. So the first is when many organizations started to put capture in their applications to deter automation, that fueled two paths for attackers. Some actually invested in focusing on developing um, bots that can defeat capture on their own. They invested in the R&D on that. However, most of the attackers just took the easier route, and they actually hire human capture solvers and click farms that are very low cost, and they just use humans to go in there and manually go through and solve the captures, and at a very low cost. So that's one example of how humans have been injected into some of the flows to combat some of the controls that have been placed. The other example is, and this is kind of an interesting one that we're just seeing to start to evolve, is that we're actually seeing AI acting like a human. And the example I'm going to give here is when Chat GPT-4 first came out, it was intelligent enough to respond to the prompts to act like a human and socially engineer a person to get them to solve a capture. So essentially, capture the model messaged TaskRabbit, a worker, to ask them to solve capture. When the person responded back, "How do I know you're not a robot?" Joking around, it was in, ChatGPT was intelligent enough to trigger an emotion within that individual and respond, basically saying, "Hey, I'm visually impaired, so I can't do it. So I'm looking to get somebody to help me." And of course, if you're on the other side of that from a human socially engineer perspective, you're like, "Oh man, I'm sorry. Let me help you out." And they were able to bypass capture by being intelligent enough to socially engineer a person. So there's a lot of other examples, but those are just two examples of using humans and then using human-like automation to act like a human.
Kind of a continuing arms race, right?
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
built something to protect, they built something to overcome the protection, and on and on and on. Josh, let's bring you back in here for a little bit. Almost every organization that's been around any time is going to have some legacy security programs, some legacy security processes and equipment and software around. Looking across delivery, operations, and risk management, what are some ways these legacy security programs leave gaps in the protection that you might not know about?
Yeah, good question, Keith. Yeah, certainly something that I'm sure most of the organizations, the folks that are listening right now deal with in certain areas of their business. The reality is, that legacy security programs leave gaps in many ways because differentiating between attackers and real customers is difficult. Angel's been talking about a lot of the, AI components there where the traditional methods we've used just aren't as effective as they used to be. And those automated methods are targeting efforts to bypass those traditional controls that we have in place. And from a traditional security controls perspective, such as basic WAF and what SIM systems can detect, security information and event management, they're just not sufficient to identify and prevent bot attacks on APIs. Part of that is because a high amount of machine-to-machine communications occurring there. When we have API to API traffic, and attackers can appear more like normal app behavior on the surface, but behind the scenes, APIs can be exploited and abused, allowing attackers to elude detection until it's too late. So, traditional security tools are even more ineffective in stopping API bot attacks because they aren't designed specifically for APIs in many cases. So firstly, traditional tools can't effectively distinguish between bot and human activity, and between good and bad bot activity. And so this severely limits their ability to protect APIs against those, bot-based attacks. Secondly, with fewer clues that bots leave and fewer details that APIs collect, Traditional tools just can't effectively decide if an API is malicious or legitimate in that environment. So essentially, bots request the same data as they would with browser attacks. The difference is that API bot attacks give no information about the browser version, the cookies that are used, the device type it's coming from, used by traditional tools that traditionally detect bot activity. And API attacks are completely virtual. Bots can spin around the attacks, move between different clouds, rotate IP addresses. Some of the things we've mentioned before, use proxy networks, which throw off traditional defenses in many cases. And so, many organizations historically focused on monitoring their web traffic with tools such as WAF and bot detection and SIEM, so that criminals have adapted their strategies and now are heavily attacking, and targeting APIs with malicious bots because, they act as a direct point to easily access data. And in this case, many of the different industries we've talked about, valuable data. And so resources and business logic functionality also comes into play there, where attacks are easier than ever to orchestrate. Some of the open web, things that we've talked about where attackers can go and gain access to very easy methods to try and orchestrate these attacks with readily available tools. And of course, those are harder to detect with legacy bot defense techniques.
Okay. All right. This has been a great discussion. Now, we've got a bunch of questions coming in. Before we have to wrap today, I want to get to at least a couple of them. And F5, of course, can follow up with other questions that have come in during the event. But, Angel, so I want to ask you a couple of the top questions that we're seeing from attendees right now. Here's one that looks really interesting. So, what obstacles do organizations face when attempting to get a handle on the risk and threat of account takeover?
Yeah, so one of the biggest obstacles I see is that organizations need a cybersecurity strategy that can actually adapt as quickly as criminals do so that they can continuously enhance their security posture. And a barrier to that is often their own people, processes, and technology, which causes teams not to effectively work together. Another big obstacle I see organizations facing that is a barrier for them to have more of that ability to adapt their security strategy is that most organizations are not correlating that full customer journey in the many different ways their users are engaging across all their channels, whether it be web, mobile, API, call centers. And they really need to do this because criminals are gaming one channel to go after another. And password reset is a great example of that. We saw a surge in criminals going after contact centers to change passwords to log into their apps, and now they're manipulating that within APIs to conduct account takeovers. So those are really the biggest obstacles I see. Organizations really need to start planning for a cybersecurity strategy that can adapt as quickly as criminals are retooling and adapting.
Okay, here's one that looks like it probably may have come from a C-level attendee, and it goes back to something we talked about earlier, and knowing how vulnerable an organization might be to these ATOs. Here's the question: how can an organization assess its current level of protection, and how can they communicate this security posture to the executive leadership to secure the budget required to improve it? That second part may be even tougher than the first part.
Right. Yeah. Well, I can take that one. So what I'd recommend is, for organizations to assess their current risk level is starting with creating a security risk assessment. And there's a lot of great tools out there they can use as a framework to make sure they're touching upon all the key things. Which, like the NIST framework would be an example of that. And that includes assessing risk and compliance, evaluating your existing security governance, including data privacy, third-party risk, IT regulatory compliance. And as you go through that assessment, I'd recommend that you look for vulnerabilities. Remember when I talked about the obstacle, your people, processes, and technologies to better understand your potential points of compromise. So when you're looking at your people, do you have the right levels of access controls? Have your people been properly trained? And this also should include things like embracing zero trust and risk-based security principles, such as limiting the available methods, inspecting payloads, and preventing unauthorized data exposure, and implementing access controls and risk-based authentication for objects and functions. It also could include things like collecting intelligence and building a baseline for that normal behavior patterns, so that you can detect the difference between good and bad. When you're looking at processes, you really should take a look at it. Do you have clearly documented processes for certifying, engaging, monitoring, and alerting? And this could start with what Josh was talking about earlier, including an inventory audit of all your APIs and scripts. So you're not going to be able to secure those and understand the vulnerabilities of those if you're not aware of it. This also should include a process for continuously monitoring and protecting your API endpoints to identify modifications to app integrations, detect vulnerable components, and potential manipulation of the business logic we talked about earlier. When you're looking at your technology posture, you should really be taking a look at, do you have that right tools to inspect, detect, and react when your apps and APIs are being modified or compromised? So this includes ability to react to changing application life cycles by preventing security misconfigurations across all your environments. It should include the ability to mitigate abuse that can lead to compromise or denial of services. And this needs to be looked at across your entire ecosystem, across all your clouds and architectures. And part of your technology strategy is really assessing, do you have that rapid mitigation strategy to be able to block network calls that are inappropriately exploiting data? And by having it in more centralized locations, your team can quickly review your APIs and scripts, and quickly block and alert, gives you the ability to improve upon your assessment of raw. So that's what I would start with as far as when you're doing an assessment.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Keith, I also heard you, ask part of the question there was about how do you get the budget, right? So,
Yeah.
Angel has certainly painted a really good view there of the people, process, technology components, and I think the important piece is first of all, communicate the risk of exposure. The E-staff is really concerned about revenue costs and compliance. A recent study by IT Group out of Boston said that account takeover attacks across all industries cost more than $16 billion in losses in 2022, which is an amazingly large number. And so it's important for us to think about, how do we make sure that we've got the right protections in place, and then how do we justify those protections? That's a 300% jump from what we saw in 2021. And of course, most of those account takeovers are fueled by AI-driven bots. As a matter of fact, findings have shown that 75 to 85% of all login attempts in the second half of 22 were account takeover attempts. So, it's important for executives, to get an understanding of how a security breach could impact the organization's bottom line, explain how the security breach, could damage the organization's reputation. And then, of course, we've talked about some of the compliance penalties that could come into place. So, the SEC requiring public companies to report material breaches within 4 days. A fine, per violation there is $200,000 per incident. Of course, if it's a ransomware event that occurs because you've got an account takeover of an administration account, companies are having to pay into the millions per attack at this point. And then you've got the other hard costs of the cost of your IT teams having to deal with account takeover attempts and breaches. You've got dealing with customer support, the legal fees from what you've had to deal with from those exposures, and then of course you've got external incident response teams that may have had to be involved in those events. So the costs mount quickly, as you can see, and I think it's pretty easy to put a business case together to not only help put the hard costs in place, but then also to try and justify what the long-term impact could be to the business's reputation and trust in the market.
Absolutely, Josh. I mean, what I hear you saying is for companies that are wondering if they can afford the security measures that they need to counter these ATO attacks, well, the better question is, can you afford not to? Anymore. You're just, elucidating some of the impacts, and they're just devastating, and they're increasing. Well, Josh and Angel, I want to thank you so much for this conversation today. I learned a ton, and I think the attendees did too. This is a topic that, in my opinion, continues to be underplayed a little bit too. It's not top of mind the way, for instance, ransomware is, but it really needs to be for everyone out there. Be paying attention because the bots really are coming for you. Anyway, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Likewise.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Angel. Thanks for everyone.
So that was really fun. I want to thank Angel and Josh for being on with me today and for going over in such thorough detail the issues we're facing with bots and how they're impacting your security, and in many cases you don't even know it. So next, I wanted to put some information up here so that you can take the next step with F5 and Google Cloud. Take a look at the links that are up there on the slide and click on it if you can. I'm going to leave it up here for another minute or two. And don't forget also that there's more information in the handouts section. You have another minute or two to download those handouts and get even more. So make sure you're getting all of that stuff done right now. Folks, that is a wrap for this session today. I enjoyed this such a great deal, but we do have one more piece of business before we cut you loose, and that is the Amazon gift card prize drawing. So we do have a winner now. The $250 Amazon gift card for this event goes to Tawana Staton from Arkansas. Congratulations to you, Tawana. We'll be in touch with you to get you your card. And with that, everyone, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank F5 Networks and Google Cloud for making this event possible. I want to thank you, the attendees, most of all, for being here, for your great questions, for your attention to this topic, and thanks for spending part of your day with us. That concludes the event. Have a great rest of your day.